Welcome to the Community Lecture Series, sponsored by the UW Stevens Point College of Letters and Science, and my name is Scott Tappa. I work in the Dean's office. I'm one of his assistants for marketing and events like this, so happy to be here. All over this room you'll see these brochures, and it's got the listing of lectures that we've got coming up this year, a wide variety of interesting topics. Dr. Barta is here. She'll be giving next month's talk on the history of beer, so looking forward to learning more about that in 4 weeks. But tonight we're excited to have Dr. Peter Zani. Peter is an associate professor of biology at UWSD, and he's the curator of amphibians and reptiles in our Museum of Natural History. Growing up in eastern Ohio, he liked to catch frogs, toads, salamanders, and turtles, and kept turtles as pets during the summer. He went to college intending to do research on reptiles, and he spent the last 25 years doing just that. He earned his bachelor's degree at Miami University, his master's at the University of Oklahoma, and his doctorate at the University of Oregon. Tonight Pete will be talking about a project that has had quite a local impact. You may have seen it on the news. There's been a lot of press that it's pretty exciting that the work's getting recognition, involving turtles, Jordan Pond, and Highway 66 east of Stevens Point. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Peter Zani.
Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you for coming out tonight. I am Pete Zani, and I will talk about some of the road mortality that happens locally and what we've done over the past several years to try to mitigate or alleviate that problem. Before I begin, I want to make sure that I acknowledge all of the people who did the hard work for this project that you get to see the results of, including all the turtle wranglers from the 4 different years, some of which are pictured here showing their turtle wrangling skills. And the undergraduate students from UWSP really made this project possible because of their hard work over the course of the summer. And then I'd also like to thank representatives of the Wisconsin DOT, in addition to the Department of Transportation, the Department of Natural Resources. So we have several individuals from the DOT and DNR pictured here, including some people who are here tonight, like Anthony, formerly of the DOT. And then UWSP Representative Nancy Shefferly helped out quite a bit. Jordan County Park was very gracious in allowing us to do the work, and several members of the Stevens Point community, including some local residents, Paul and Dennis, who are here tonight as well. And then finally, I want to thank the Department of Transportation and the Department of Natural Resources for the funding for this project, who made this project possible by their generosity. My talk boils down to 2 parts. There's the talk where we talk about or interest ourselves in the fence and how the fence has alleviated the problem of turtles getting onto the roadway. And then once we put the barrier into the way, we have to have a tunnel that now allows wildlife to pass under the roadway to avoid the road in the first place. So we have 2 different components to this. I'm going to talk mostly about the fence first, and then we'll move on to the tunnel and talk about aspects of the tunnel. Why is this project here in the first place? So before we even get into the fence or the tunnel, we have to understand why we're gathered to talk about this. The Department of Natural Resources maintains a citizen database that they put together a list of or a map of all the locations in the state where they have turtle problems, or at least turtles crossing the road. And as you can see here in central Wisconsin, we have that one bright red spot. It's this spot here along Highway 66 that was over 50 animals a year being estimated crossing the highway. No other spot really in central Wisconsin comes close, maybe a few spots down along the frontage road by Portage, but otherwise, Stevens Point has one of the heavier spots for turtle road crossing in the local area. So what that meant was when the state decided to repave portions of Highway 66, by state law, they're required to go to the DNR and ask them, are there any biological issues that we have to be aware of? The DNR says, heck yeah, there are. There's this spot we have to do something about. So then they came to me and asked, can we apply best scientific principles to the project? Can we get a sense of, is the project actually working? Because we want to put in a fence, we want to put in a tunnel, but we want to make sure that it works as well, so they're getting bang for our buck. So there's that collaborative nature that happened in 2013 and 14, where we had several long planning meetings to talk about what we're going to do to this particular site itself. So this is the crossing at the dam at Jordan Park. So the the dam is actually behind me. The wetland on the left here is the shallow area that's an impoundment just off of Jordan Pond that's right along State Highway 66. This is the Burlowski cutoff there. So to the south we have marshland, and to the north we have a wetland. And what happens is turtles will get swept over the raceway or the dam, and then on their journey back to the pond where they want to be, they'll cross the road and they will get hit by cars. So there was several issues going on here. So this was the site initially. If we look at that site from a satellite image, what you can see on Google Earth is that picture I just took was about here looking in this direction. That state highway, that being resurfaced, encompassed the entire components of the dam as well. So here's the dam. This is the raceway spillway that then leads down into the power plant and then joins the Plover River again after the hydropower is generated from that. So that junction then becomes the issue because now we have this known area where there's a pulse of turtle mortality. If you go to Google Earth and you zoom in, you can actually see the September 1st, 2016 image. You can see the result of the project. There's the fence there. And I just wanted to point that out before we begin. You can see the results in terms of the grading I'll talk about in a second. And then that's me. And that's my truck, or at least before I gave to Dennis. It's always fun to know where you are. Why is this an issue? Because the project got going so early, we could do an initial year where we tried to gauge what the problem was and where the problem was. So we had a lot of citizen involvement helping us determine where that location of that problem was going to be. And then in 2015, we simply had students go out all summer long, walk the road on either side, and then every time they spotted a dead turtle, they would record where it was and what kind of turtle it was. So here are all 66 road mortalities that occur in 2015. And at least for this year, what we wanted to know was where is the best place to put the tunnel, because we weren't quite sure where to put that. And it was very clear that we have this area here where we get the center of it. We were going to put fences on either side here to help prevent turtles from moving. So here in red, you can see where the eventual fences went. So between the dam and the raceway, there's a fence to prevent animals from coming up. And then between the raceway all the way down to the far end of the impoundment of this little berm, we have fence. And then on this side, at least on the state paved portion, we have fence as well. So the fence was determined to be most needed in this particular stretch of highway. So the fence itself is relatively short. It's only about knee high, so about 18 inches. It's buried about 6 inches deep. It's made up of 1-inch chain with a top. So Mark here is demonstrating the top. So you can see there's this top to prevent animals from crossing over. At the raceway and the dam end, it just ties right into those so animals can't get around it. And then they're forced along the fence rather than through the fence or over the fence. At the terminal ends are these segments here that simply wrap back on themselves. And the idea is an animal that walks along here will just mosey back in the right direction if it keeps going far enough along. And each terminal segment has one of these turnarounds. And these turnarounds work really well. For much of how we know things work in this particular project, it's because of the wildlife cameras where we're able to see visually, or at least estimate, what's going on in these. So in those turnarounds, we know the animals will come to this particular spot and then turn around and head back in the right direction. So the turnarounds seem to work very well as terminal segments and as ways to affect turtle behavior. The problem is, as soon as we put in the fence, we create a barrier for animals to be able to get to where they want to go, which is to the wetland. So for example, animals that miss the fence and get out into the highway can cross the highway, and they still have a fence in their way to get to the other side. So there's a painted turtle that's up against the fence there that wants to get into the wetland to your left, but because of the fence itself, it missed it on one side, didn't make it through the tunnel, and now it's kind of trapped there. So one of the things that we noticed happening was animals would then try to take this somewhat dangerous journey to slide themselves down the tunnel tie-in. So you can see the collar of the tunnel, the white thing, and then the fence tying into that. This particular female did what you would expect. She fell over. Took her about 5 minutes to finally right herself to an upright position and then finally move on, but she struggled there for a good 5 minutes by those pictures. I will say this about the pictures that you'll see. None of them are, I should say, for at least the turtles, the pictures themselves are all time-lapse rather than infrared sensor. All the wildlife cameras that you buy have a movement sensor, which is all infrared based. Well, for animals like turtles that don't have a high body temperature relative to their environment, rarely will they trip the sensor enough to actually trigger a picture, so we have to do time-lapse. So in this particular case, these are 1-minute time-lapse pictures. So that's how we know it took her 5 minutes to get through there, is because of the 1-minute time-lapse. So one of the things we did was to try to mitigate the problem of the fence now being a barrier in one way. We tried to create one-way passages. So a passive design where animals can go from one side of the fence to the other. So we actually cut a hole in the fence way up high and then had a ramp of dirt that allows animals to get up high and then slide down this aluminum flashing into this pile of sand and then go into the wetland where they want to go. So that little dot there is a turtle. That's the first documented case of a turtle coming up to and approaching the tunnel before going through, or the passive slide before going through. And so in this case, in the very next photo, you see the animal is gone from that spot. But if I back up, if you watch this area here, you'll be able to see the sand move where it slid. So you can actually see that animal's sliding path. So we don't have to have direct visual confirmation to be able to tell what these animals are doing. And that's by design. We want a movable substrate, so when the animals move through, we can actually see their footprints or see, in this case, the drag of the shell marks through it. So that is our first estimate of animals actually successfully moving through. We put in additional ones of these this past spring because one of the problems that's happening is on the far side of Brulowski, that forested area has a toad population that is crossing the road in the spring to get into the shallow wetland to breed, and in doing so, coming up against the fence, which is in its way, burrowing into the leaves, oftentimes drying out and dying because they can't get through the fence and don't ever figure out to go all the way around it. So what we did was we put in these passive things where here's the opening with a small ramp, and then that drops off on the other side. This is amplexing pair, so there's a male and a female together, and they come up to and then go through the overpass, or the passive excluder. So you can actually see it meanders around a little bit, but then does actually go through that. So we now have these passive excluders that are meant to help animals if they get to the wrong side of the fence. So what does the fence do? Pre-fence, we have 66 animals that we recorded as being hit by cars on the road there, and then we could map out. So that's our 2015 baseline estimate. We then put in the fence in 2016, which means 2016 is our complex year in that we have a period of pre-fence, we have a period of construction, and then we have a period of post-fence. So the 26 is much lower than the 66, first of all, but it's not as low as we had hoped. And the thing to take away from this is in the 2 months following the tunnel actually going in, we only had 4 post-construction deaths. So 22 of those were either during or pre-construction. And then the other thing to notice is it looks like we have some animals that are missing the fence entirely that we're including in our data as being roadkill, or get out into this intersection with Brulowski, maybe missing the fence entirely. So then one of the things that we did very early on was to go out and add additional fencing here across the snowmobile path through Jordan Park. So the snowmobile path comes along the highway and then down through Jordan Park like this. And so we seasonally will extend this gate across that to try to prevent or at least catch turtles coming through into the fencing rather than around fencing. And that may actually account for some of this during the construction period. Once the fence went in, turtles may have been going around the fence because they didn't have a tunnel to go through yet. So this 2016 was a weird year for us. How about 2017? The first full year where we have the fence and tunnel operating, we only had 10 roadkill. And if you look at some of these, there are 3 out here that are beyond the fencing, and there's 1 over here beyond the fencing. So there's at least 4 that were never going to get caught by the fencing either way. And then there are a couple that may have just gone around the edge of the fencing, gotten to the intersection of Brulowski, and then been caught there. I'm pretty sure that this snapping turtle was a really large snapping turtle that got across the road by going around the fence, because there's some photos of a big snapping turtle right around this time along the wrong side of the fence, and then very soon after that we get a road mortality. So I think that animal may have missed the fence as well. So the road mortality itself drops to almost nothing in the year where we have a full year's worth of data. 2018, last year, we have a little bit of a pulse, 26, but there's an interesting explanation for that. In 2018, in September, the 10-year inspection of the Jordan Pond Dam was done, and so the whole reservoir was drained, and that additional flow probably swept a whole lot of turtles over the reservoir dam, and then they were trying to return back and get on the roadway instead. 10 animals were killed in that 2-week period. So that little pulse of only 16 the entire rest of the summer, 10 animals killed in that really strong pulse suggests that we're only getting maybe 10 to 16 animals killed a year normally. 2019, the current year, not yet done. turtles will cross the road until about mid-October is when they really start to slow down after the days stop getting up to 70 degrees. We have about 7 so far, 7 confirmed ones, and for whatever reason, they're mostly snapping turtles this year. But we have a much lower number of these, and many of them are focused here in the intersection with Burlowski. And in talking with people like Dennis, our local resident who lives down here, this segment may be what we need to fence in order to prevent turtles from crossing into the highways. We may need to prevent them from getting from the raceway out into the on Burlowski and then simply following that corridor. And otherwise, we have a relatively low number. So the take home is, pre-fence, there's a whole lot of mortality. Post-fence, there's almost none. The fence is amazingly effective at preventing turtles from getting into the roadway and actually being killed by that. How effective? The roadway fencing has reduced turtle mortality by 75 to 85%. So we're only seeing 15 to 25% of the level of mortality that we saw prior to the fence going in. And then the other thing we can say is road mortality looks like it's now occurring mostly on the edges of the fence where the fence ends and turtles are simply going around that fence. So maybe we can try to think about ways that we can prevent the animals from getting around it, but otherwise, even reducing it this far is a win in my opinion. All right, so now we have a sense that the fence works. What about the tunnel? In order to talk about the tunnel, we have to back up and talk about the construction phase, and even further, we have to talk about the design phase, because there's a lot of limitations associated with the tunnel that become important in our expectations about how well the tunnel should work. So the top is a photo during construction, but really it's this during construction installation of the tunnel that I really wanted to focus on. So the tunnel was poured as these concrete segments and then assembled and put in. From the mouth of the tunnel on one end of the highway, underneath the entire highway to the other was 68 feet. With a diameter tunnel this small, we knew there were going to be problems. So what are the diameters of the tunnel? It's only about 1.17 feet tall. It's just under 2 feet long. And then the center segment, the segment that really matters, we got down to 39 feet. How do we get that center segment down? We got it down by some creative ways that I'll tell you in a second. Why does this matter? This is our surface area, or a cross-sectional area for the view that turtles are going to see as they're trying to transit the tunnel. The size of that area and the length of that tunnel become the critically important factors determining whether or not the tunnel itself will work. The state of Massachusetts commissioned a study just like this, and through lots of trial and error, they found that that's what we want as a tunnel size. So we've got a tunnel that's only 1.25 feet or so tall. The estimate is it should be about 6 feet tall. This would be a 6 feet circle relative to that. So that's what we should have had if we want about 80% success rate. In that estimate, they also found that if you go down to anything about this size, you still get a 50% success rate. So we still get pretty good success down to this far. However, when you go down below that, success rate was only about 20%. And we knew that we were going to be at this low end based on the constraints associated with this. So why was the tunnel constraint? Why did we make it bigger? Two things going on. One, notice the water table in the picture above. It's really up near the roadbed, which means we can't go very deep or else we risk punching a hole in the dam, and that would, I think we all can agree, would be bad to have the dam fail. So we didn't want to go deep. Here in Wisconsin, the freeze-thaw means that we can't go very shallow or else we'll get road heave and we'll get a speed bump at 55 miles an hour, and that, I think we can all agree, is also bad. So there's a limit to how tall that can be and there's a limit to how deep that can be. That's why the 1.17 feet is our limit. We tried to make it bigger by squashing it out, but there's a limit construction-wise as to how big we can do that. So to compare, this is what minimum I think we should have wanted, and yet we weren't able to achieve that. So we knew there were going to be problems. We knew that in terms of what that Massachusetts study found, that we were going to be down near the 20% success rate to begin with. So we weren't going to have perfect success. One of the ways we mitigate that problem in the first place was in the design phase, we came up with these gratings that now are a small chamber on the shoulders of the road that now allow light down into the chamber to help entice turtles at least that far. And then the central part is this 39 feet that is relatively small. So the 39 feet comes from the fact that we have these lighted areas that help mitigate the 68 feet from the total thing. As you can see, when we went in there to do some maintenance and remove some material, the lighting is actually pretty good. When you're in there, you can actually see how lighted it is. So from a lighting point of view, the gratings work amazingly well. They really do allow quite a bit of light. And what we see in photos is animals will go readily into this far, and then whether or not they take the jump into the next stage becomes the big question. And you can really see that on this picture. You can see there's that chamber where the substrate's really bright and light, and then you get that dark inner area. We thought about lights, had to set that aside. Who's going to maintain it? Who's going to pay for it? If it breaks, who's going to fix it? So we had problems. The watchword for this project was sustainability. We wanted it to be a passive project that we didn't have to maintain and go out there every year and fix, because it has to basically last for the life until the next resurfacing project comes along, which is going to be quite a while. One of the things we noticed was that the backdrop with vegetation on the far side of the pond is actually pretty dark, pretty green. So that actually makes it more of a challenge, because the lightedness is really what the turtles want. They want to go into a bright lit area. So because we had the sand from when we went in and removed it, the first thing we tried was just pile up the sand here and create a backdrop of lighted substrate. And you can see there's the pile of sand versus the native dark vegetation. It worked like a charm. Just put something light behind it. From the turtle eye view, they can actually see that reflection of that off that sand. And it looks like that really helps entice turtles to go through the tunnel much more readily. The problem is sand will erode, people will step on it, so we didn't want to do that as a permanent solution. So instead, what I did a couple years ago was to go out and build these aluminum flashing structures. So what they are is simply aluminum flashing on a black iron's backdrop that are simply placed right in the way of the tunnel itself to now reflect light into those, but also provide something that's light and easily maintainable. And the idea is, if the DOT were to implement this kind of thing in the future, they could just use like at the back of a road sign as the material that they put here. So we're thinking ahead in terms of how they could implement this. One of the things we noticed was that turtles would simply go right past the tunnel on the south side and not even be interested in the tunnel itself. So the aluminum flashing is now a guide to help force the turtles in. I've shortened it a little bit since then, but it's the same concept, which is we want the turtles to be walking in that direction and then make the decision to go in or not. It doesn't seem like it's a problem on the north side, mostly because the vast majority of transits are from the south side to the north side. So how does that flashing backdrop work? It works like a charm. So you can tell this is a sunny day because you can see the sun reflecting off of the grating inside. Even on a bright sunny day, the sand is lit very brightly, but the backdrop vegetation isn't. On a cloudy day like this, where you don't see any sun, you still get the really bright backdrop. So that backdrop does seem to create not only light reflecting into the tunnel, but a very light backdrop that helps entice the turtles into the tunnel. So they don't seem to mind that change whatsoever. A couple of the other problems we noticed as this project went on, as vegetation grew up along the fence here, we had a problem where turtles could actually scale this. So even though it looks like crap because of my spray foam addiction, what you can see with aluminum flashing here is now we have something that prevents the animals from climbing up. And that works really well. So now they can't climb that fence, they can't get a grip. We do have some photos where we have animals that are able to get up here and cross this. And that's how, a couple years ago, most of them seemed to be getting onto the roadway, was able to escape the fencing itself somehow by finding a gap. The other thing we try to do is, noticing that turtles, if they get out here, might want to come back, I created these slides that now help with this edge. If turtle gets in there, it's a passive slide as well to force turtles back into the roadway. So there's several things going on here. And then finally, you can see the camera view. There's a camera and a backup camera looking down the tunnel so that we can monitor this. In all cases, we have this nice movable substrate so that we can see things moving, try to keep the vegetation trimmed up so that you don't have other things going on. And in doing so, what you can see is, in some cases, some really nice transits. So here's an example from last summer where we can see the transit. So here's the animal here. And when I go to the next slide, what you'll see is the animal has walked down along here, come back up, and then ended up right here. And how can we tell that? Just the substrate moves. So you can see where the substrate moves all along that. I'll back up so you can see, it doesn't really go anywhere, but it does actually, in that 1 minute change, actually move quite a bit. Then in the next one, it just moves about 6 inches. There, it doesn't really go anywhere else. So this one, it disappears. Now the question is, does it go into the tunnel, or does it simply go past the tunnel? And if you look at the area over here, you can actually see the path of the animal as it walks along there. So in this case, we can tell from these photos that the animal simply went around the flashing, went along the fence edge, and then kept going. So this would be a failed attempt. It would be an attempt that wasn't successful. Animals go into the tunnel quite a bit in some cases, and then decide, no, I'm not going to do that. This animal went down the fence for a while and then came back and decided to go in. So we can infer a lot from what's going on in a transit like this just by the tracks that the animals are leaving. So here's an animal here that's going to walk up along here, cross behind this, and then walk up on this section. And you can kind of see the animal's tracks here. It's really hard to see, which is why I put a circle around it, but in that lighted chamber, even though it's very dim, the turtle actually did make it that far. It's a couple minutes after, so it's 2 minutes later, but you can see where the change was, so we know the turtle's in there. And then this one's really subtle, but the next picture will have the turtle on the far side. You'll just see the bump. There it is. You can see the bump. So that's the turtle. That's what we're dealing with in this project. So it is subtle. Some of those changes, that little bump change was the turtle going in. We didn't see any tracks coming back out. And just for verification, on the north side, we have a camera as well that shows us just a few minutes later that that animal made it all the way through and made it back into the wetland. So here's a success where we can infer it from the different pieces of information that we have available. For the bigger things, it's usually pretty easy. One of the things we noticed is mammals and reptiles move differently, and then that allows us information that we can detect as well. Mammals tend to have their limbs underneath them when they're walking, so they're creating a really narrow track, and they're not dragging their feet as much. Turtles drag their shell or their tail or their feet, and they're wide, so they leave a wide track. We can tell the size of the animal based on the track. We can also tell the relative age, in some cases the species, to try to identify individuals. So I don't want to show you a lot of data, but we have to at least have some to see the pattern that emerges. We only have 2 months worth of data here in 2016 that shows us, in this case, attempts being these open circles. This is simply whether or not an animal tried it. And then all the black circles are whether or not the animal succeeded. So we had 5 successes out of the 32 attempts in that first fall. And that's a low rate. What we expected was about 20%, but we only had about 16%. Hopefully that's just small sample size. The next year we have a complete sampling year, and now we see there's actually a lot of successes. There's a lot of black dots on here. There's several things about this that are important. One is there's not really a seasonal component. Yes, it starts and yes, it ends, but the tries are all year long. The successes are all year long. It's not just during the breeding season, so this isn't just a nesting turtle problem. It's probably just turtles getting swept over the raceway accidentally. So we know that there are successes that occur here. In this case, 38 of 168 attempts were successful, 23%. On the right side of the 20% number that we expected. So we think we're doing the right thing in terms of getting turtles to figure out and succeed in this. What about last year? I don't have the current year's data done. Last year, again, we see a nice even throughout most of the year with successes most of the year. And then we get this pulse. That pulse, remember, was the drawdown of the dam. So the dam drew down. Not only do we have a pulse in road mortality, we have a pulse in attempts. This is a huge spike in attempts. There's a huge spike in successes. Our record day was 13 attempts in one day. We have never had anything near that. And that record number of successes in one day as well, five successes. And that's because the number of animals that were simply moving around in that. So if we had anything to figure out, it's in future drawdowns, we have to be out there to help monitor the population. So that window, that's when the drawdown occurred. We have a very similar success rate between years. So we think we're able to entice many of the turtles that need to be, or at least help maintain habitat connectivity. Of the 279 turtles that we have tried to individually identify, and this is what we think is an estimate of how many have tried it, 487 different attempts. An animal can make multiple attempts in this. 109 of those have been successful. So of the 109 out of 487, that's about 22 total success rate. And then about a third of the individuals who have attempted to go through the tunnel have succeeded, about 39%, 109 of the 279 total. So we have about a success rate of 1 out of 3. So not ideal, but it's not the 20% that we thought we might get with the Massachusetts estimates, but it's not perfect either. And then finally, what I want to talk about is the things that aren't turtles that use the tunnel. So there have been a dozen non-turtle species that have gone through the tunnel itself. And we know this from the photos that we have. So you can test yourself to see which of these you know. Raccoon, beaver, striped skunk, all have gone through the tunnel. Muskrat, in fact, this is the most common mammal out there. It goes through the tunnel sometimes 3 or 4 times a day. It's annoying because you'll see a track and then you have to figure out, was that a turtle? No, it's just this really narrow thing that moves really fast. Rarely do we see them on camera because they're moving so fast. They go through the tunnel in about 30 seconds. This is hard to see. Let me hit the light so you can see it a little bit better. Mink on the left, short-tailed weasel on the right, both of which use the tunnel, not regularly. A couple years ago, we actually saw a mink with her babies going through the tunnel. So that wildlife corridor along the river is pretty impressive. Porcupine. That's a possum, that's right. They're not common here, right near the northern limit to their range. A tail that looks like a rat, but bigger than a rat. Yeah, so we don't have great pictures of it, but a possum did go through there one time. So we know that other animals will go through there. I think this is my favorite. An entire family of ducks decided one day to just come through the tunnel. So the tunnel doesn't just serve turtles, it serves other wildlife. And it's an important connector for habitat, and it's important for maintaining the genetics of the populations and helping animals move around and avoid roadway mortality. But also because that is a 55 miles per hour corridor, it helps prevent motorists having interactions with animals that might be dangerous. So that's it in terms of information. I'd like to invite you to like us on Friends of the Plover River Turtles on Facebook. This is a public site, so you don't have to be a member of Facebook to actually access that information. You can see our photos. We do post a lot of the webcam photos. I'm going to start going through the photos from the summer pretty soon, so we'll post any photos like this that we have found, any interactions, that kind of thing. I would also like to say the reason this project got going is that the state of Wisconsin knew about it. This form, which I have copies of, is a form that they have a web link as well, where the information from citizens and the citizen monitoring network really helped create this solution, because they helped, the citizen base helped determine that this was the problem site in the first place. So if you want to get involved, the single biggest thing you can do is to take one of these forms, take a couple if you want, give it to someone who might put this to good use, to be able to report to the state where the problem areas are, so that in the future, when there are problem areas that come up and we know about, that the state can then take appropriate action. So this is where the citizen connection is really important, to make sure that we get that insight from the citizens. And then finally, I would just like to thank you for your attendance tonight. I'm happy to entertain any questions. Yes, sir.
There's a tunnel out there that you can walk through.
There is. That's further down. That's a pedestrian tunnel. And that's on the other side with some riprap along that corner that turtles have a really hard time getting up through the rocks there. So that's why that riprap is really why that doesn't get used by turtles.
You didn't say anything about the conception of this project, and what was the reaction for the first guy said, you want to do what?
Well, I mean, there are projects like this elsewhere. So when I got contacted by Anthony and Mark, I said, absolutely. I think this is an issue that we can, even though I didn't know that was an issue here locally, just knowing that there are ways that we can help solve this, and that there are other projects that we can draw on their knowledge and apply some of that. That's why I wanted to be involved, is I thought it as a good local project that will allow to have students involved and really engage with the conservation message that we wanted to perpetuate.
Was the DOT reluctant?
Again, they're required by state law to go to the DNR and ask, are there issues? So I don't know about reluctant. I can't speak to their state of mind, but I can say they were very gracious partners in the whole process. That the back and forth, the conversations that we had were very constructive. Keep in mind, the DOT has very precise goals to maintain roadway function, to a roadway safety corridor. They don't care about the turtles to the degree they care about the roadway and automobile and traffic. Like, that's what they're focused on. So recognizing that that is their goal, to mitigate traffic issues, anything that we can do to mitigate the turtles now indirectly satisfies their requirements of we don't want a big snapping turtle in the middle of the road in that corridor. So they recognized that all what we're trying to do is the same thing, which is make that a safer corridor for motorists and make that a safer corridor for animals, and then make it a corridor that helps conservation as well. So it was a win-win-win in that regard.
They probably look, I'm Dennis, and I have lived out there for 30 years. So that area, when I first moved out there, was nothing to be going down the bridge and see two snappers on the roadway. And so the only option you had was to stop your vehicle, get out of it, and take one snapper off and another. Now, can you imagine a Sunday afternoon, and you got 5 cars coming east, 5 cars coming west, they all stop and wait for you to take those turtles off. Everybody out there was really good about it. But you would come the next day and there would be one killed. Or there'd be an otter killed, or a mink, just like Pete said. They had no place.
So Dennis is exactly right. So the problem was there were lots of turtles who were getting out in the roadway, who were being problem animals, and we knew that this was a problem not just from Dennis's observation over the last 30 years, but like colleagues like Bob Bell, who lives in the area, told us exactly where he thought the problem was, and we had anecdotes that this was a problem. So this problem was long in the need for fixing. It's just, it took a while for the right things to come together.
How far down Burlowski Road do you count?
We don't go much past the extent of the fencing itself, so we kind of stop at the south end of the Snowmobile Trail. So we don't really go down Burlowski there. But what we've noticed is the first year we did, so I should correct myself, the first year we did do that, and we didn't see much mortality along there. I don't see any on the map. So we were scanning that area, we just weren't seeing anything there. So mortality definitely seems to be up near the stop sign, closer to the stop sign.
When you were collecting your initial mortality data, you said you were using a lot of citizen reports, but also students. What was the general frequency of counting, and how did you make sure that you weren't double counting?
So I had students the first 2 or 3 years out there 2 to 3 times a day. So they would have a morning shift, and an afternoon shift, and then an evening shift. And then the next thing we would do is we would remove and actually save in that particular year all the carcasses, so we weren't counting them. So that's I wasn't sure the identification would be easy when you have a smashed turtle. Sometimes it can be really hard. So if the students weren't sure about what they were seeing, they could save the specimen and then we could take it and remove it. So we were removing them to avoid double counting. If anything, 66 is an underestimate. Because if a crow comes along and takes a hatchling snapping turtle, then it doesn't get counted.
If there's 23% success rate, what happens to the other turtles that don't make it?
That's an excellent question. I don't know. What we know is the animals go back and forth, and then in some cases they go back into the wetland. So I suspect that a number of them are simply going downstream and are ending up in the Plover River corridor. Or I suspect that they're going back into the raceway and perhaps being in there, or going around the road and the fence and becoming a roadkill themselves. So we don't actually know because we don't have cameras everywhere to tell us what's going on. We know they're not going around the turnarounds, so they're not going around the fence to the same frequency, so we just don't know what they're doing. They're just not successfully going through the tunnel, that's all we can say.
In your mortality pictures or photos, are the frequency of species mortality corresponding to the population of those species in the pond?
Generally speaking, yes. So softshell turtles are not well represented in the mortality data. They're also the least abundant turtle because the first 2 years we trapped as well to try to get a sense of what was out there species-wise and get a sense of their abundance. And what we found is, in terms of abundance, painted turtles and snapping turtles are the most 2 abundant things out there, with then soft-shelled turtles being a distant third. And that's what we see in terms of the mortality.
We do know that they do go down the raceway to the hydro plant, because the hydro plant has a grate before you go in, and the big snappers will come up against the grate. And the current is pretty strong, but most of them will get out of the current, get to the side, and they go up the banks. And we've even pulled a few off the grates.
And then once they get out of the grate, they can go down past the power plant and back into the river that way, or maybe go back up and get counted. That 279 individuals, I'm not confident in that. It's just that's a best estimate at this point.
Are there any studies about the speed limit impact here? Because I was surprised that it didn't get slowed down in that stretch. There's a lot of
Surprisingly, that never came up in conversations.
Really?
I figured DOT knows what they're doing with speed limits. What did come up are signs. And why there aren't signs aren't there is because the DOT and DNR says, well, people will steal them.
Yeah, but they can just paint them on the
That for some reason never got done. That was in the books, and then that never happened. So I don't know why. So if you want to go out there and spray paint a thing on the road, yeah.
What's that raccoon doing?
It's eating an egg. Yes. So we had a nest predation event September 8th, a couple days ago, where the raccoon went out there and actually found a snapping turtle nest right in the north tunnel entrance, and they dug up all the eggs. So I don't know if the eggs hatched and they got out or not. It's right around hatching and emergence time for snapping turtles.
If we are driving along 66 there and we happen to see one that doesn't, make the fence or whatever, and they're kind of wandering up and around and whatever else, if we can stop safely and get out and help them, where do you want us to put them or direct them?
So the rule of thumb is, if you can tell which way the animal is going, put it that way. Yes.
But you want us to put them over the fence?
That would be ideal. Yes, because once they're trapped there, that's the problem. So if you're going to do that, and I can't recommend it, that's right.
Okay.
So if you're going to do that, then put them on the wetland side. I mean, the north side is where they want to go.
Okay.
I believe you said that you could tell the sex of male or female.
We can tell the size and oftentimes the species. Sex is really hard. From the photos, that being upside down allowed me to identify that as a female.
Okay, so can you tell, is it the younger turtles going through there? The older
All
turtles?
age classes. That first year, all those softshell turtles down by County Road Y, that was a nest that hatched out, and 5 of those or 8 of those got hit in one day. So there was a pulse of one nest that was the result of some of those. But generally speaking, it's anything from hatchling to nesting females. There is no specific size range or anything. It seems like just anyone who gets swept over is then going to try to make it across, or then the hatchlings trying to move across. Yes?
Question I have, do you think that once that turtle goes through that tunnel, that turtle is more aptable to go through it the following year again?
I'm not sure, but I can say no based on the fact that if that were true, then the rate of successes, should be higher. So let me explain maybe more clearly. So notice the percentage goes from 16 to 23 to 23. If they're learning, that rate should go up. It doesn't really go up between one year and the next. So 23 is pretty stable. So if that rate stays the same, then I would say no, there's no evidence of them learning the tunnel is the place to go.
So you did some tracking. Did you count turtles per acre of surface water, or how do you describe the density of turtles in that pond?
You would do it by trap effort. So how many unique individuals you're estimating. And then if you want to know, say, the population size, you would estimate it based on how many marked animals you saw versus how many new animals you see over a period of time. Well, I'm not reporting it here, but I would say the population of painted turtles is in the hundreds and hundreds. We marked, I think, 250 at least in 2 years. So that's why we stopped, because it was just so much effort to get all these animals. And so there were some we saw regularly, and we still see marked animals, but just the population sizes for painteds are really big. For snappers, not as big.
You didn't mention rubberbacks, and you didn't mention the wood turtles that are there.
And that's on purpose.
Maybe this is an old tale, but I've been told that females will go back where they were from to lay their eggs, and that May is the biggest month for their travel. But that's not what's indicated there. It looks like August is the biggest month there.
Except I'm not sure that nesting is why they're moving about. So I think the fence is preventing them from making that transit and making that nesting move. They don't use the fence the same way. So what this seems like is the site isn't really where they're going from the north to the south side to nest. That's what we thought initially, but the data don't support that, because you'd be right. June would be this huge spike. Locally, it's more like June where we get the spike in nesting. So sea turtles definitely go back to where they nest before, but I'm not sure that other turtles go to the exact site to nest in multiple years. But you're exactly right. We don't seem to have that seasonal spike.
A question, the dam, they're actually looking to fix that in 2020 or 2021. Is there a way that they could do to put something to stop them from going over? I'm guessing they'd plug up the dam.
Yeah.
They'd be worried about debris catching.
Debris catching on it, I think, would be the biggest issue. I think unless you were to make it a bottom release rather than a over the top flow, I think that'd be the biggest change you could make, and I'm not sure they could do that. So I mean, that'd be something that we can consider. I just don't know off the top of my head what you can do to change the flow to prevent turtles. Perhaps putting something like a boom further out that prevents them from getting into the current, because it may just be that they're getting caught in the rapid current as they approach the raceway, which they're not aware of.
Are you going to continue this study?
Like I said, we have the photos from 2019, and I plan on putting cameras out again next year. So in terms of the passive monitoring, yes. So by design, at this point, the money's run out, the funding isn't there to support the students, but we can still do the monitoring just by the passive use of those cameras, yes.
So the turtle wranglers have retired.
The turtle wranglers have retired. There's still one on campus, but by and large, they're off to bigger and better things, grad school or other jobs. Any other questions? Well, this has been fun. Thank you very much.